It took me 50 years to learn this, and by the time I understood it, it was already too late. There's a moment in every life that never announces itself. No sirens, no warning label, just a quiet shift. So small you don't feel it happen. You wake up one day, and nothing is wrong. Everything looks fine from the outside. Bills paid, routine intact, people around you still smiling. And yet, something essential has already slipped through your hands. I used to think disaster came with noise, with explosions, with obvious mistakes you could point to and say, "That's where it went wrong." I was wrong. The most dangerous mistakes don't feel dangerous at all. They feel reasonable. They feel comfortable. They feel like waiting just a little longer. 50 years is a long time to believe you're safe. Long enough to confuse motion with progress. Long enough to mistake busyness for meaning. Long enough to believe that tomorrow will always be available, because it always has been. I remember standing in a room full of people I loved, thinking, this will last. Not because I checked, not because I protected it, but because I assumed it. Assumptions are quiet killers. The truth is, nothing important disappears all at once. It erodes, slowly, politely, while you're distracted by things that feel urgent but aren't. Careers, plans, noise, expectations that were never yours to begin with. And every time the warning appeared, I explained it away. It's just a phase. I self-fix it later. This is how life works. That sips the lie everyone believes. That life unfolds automatically. That meaning maintains itself. That the things that matter most are somehow durable. They set not, they stir, fragile, and they don't survive neglect. Looking back, I can trace the exact shape of the mistake. Not one decision, but thousands of tiny ones, each harmless on its own, each defensible, each forgettable. Until one day, you realize you've built a life that looks complete, but feels hollow when the noise finally stops. If I could go back, I wouldn't change the big moments. I wouldn't erase the failures or rewrite the successes. I would change the moments I ignored, the moments I delayed, the moments I told myself didn't matter yet, because that sits where everything was lost. And the most terrifying part, you might be standing there right now, thinking this doesn't apply to you. That sits exactly what I thought. Right before the first crack appeared, before anything broke, there was a long stretch where everything felt solid, predictable, reliable, safe. I believed in that safety the way people believe in gravity, as something permanent, unquestionable, always there, whether you paid attention or not. Life had a rhythm. Wake, work, return, repeat. Weeks folded neatly into years, years stacked quietly on top of each other. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the problem. When danger arrives slowly, it wears the mask of normalcy. It blends into routine. It convinces you that stability is the same thing as security. Psychologists call this the normalcy bias, the instinct to assume that because nothing bad has happened yet, nothing bad is coming. But long before the collapse of anything meaningful, empires, relationships, identities, there is always a golden age. People swear will last forever. Ancient cities believed their walls were impenetrable. Nations believed their systems were too established to fail. Families believed love was self-sustaining. They were all wrong. I mistook familiarity for permanence. I thought consistency meant strength. That because things hadn't fallen apart, they couldn't. So I stopped checking the foundations. I stopped asking hard questions. Stopped listening when discomfort whispered instead of screamed. Why would I? Everything looked fine. Denial doesn't feel like denial. When it's comfortable, it feels like optimism, like confidence, like maturity. You stir overthinking. I told myself, everyone lives like this. This is just how adulthood feels. And there were signs, not loud ones. Small hesitations, brief silences where there used to be laughter. a sense that time was moving faster than it should. But safety breeds arrogance. When nothing has gone wrong for a long time, you start believing you're exempt. That warnings are for other people. That consequences belong to other lives. History is filled with last calm summers, final peaceful seasons before everything changes. People planting gardens, making plans, postponing difficult conversations. No one panics, because panic would imply danger, and danger, they believe, would be obvious. That is how the illusion holds, not by lying outright, but by telling you just enough truth to keep you still. And then, one day, something doesn't quite fit anymore. A moment that lingers too long. A feeling you can shake. A quiet realization that safety might have been borrowed time all along. I noticed it, but I didn't just act, because by then, I had already learned how easy it was to look away. And that's when the first crack finally showed itself. The first cracks never announce themselves as danger. They arrive as inconveniences, small enough to ignore, easy enough to explain. At first it was just a feeling, a subtle resistance, where effort used to feel natural. Conversations required more work. Mornings carried a weight they never had before. Moments that once felt alive now passed without leaving a mark. Nothing was broken, not technically. So I did what everyone does when reality doesn't match expectation. I adjusted the story. Used to tired, used to busy. This is normal. We are incredibly skilled at narrating our own decline in ways that sound reasonable. Psychologists have a word for this too. Rationalization. The mind's way of protecting itself from truths that demand action. Because action is expensive. Action risks discomfort. Action forces you to admit something precious is changing. I noticed how often I postponed things that mattered. Important conversations pushed to someday. Dreams reframed as impractical. Connections maintained out of habit, not presence. Still, I told myself nothing was wrong. After all, the structure was still standing. Cracks don't destroy buildings. Neglect does. But cracks are evidence. Proof that pressure exists, even if you can't see its source. I remember the first moment I felt it clearly. A quiet evening. Nothing dramatic. Just the sudden awareness that time felt thinner, like sand slipping faster through my hands than it used to. That thought frightened me, so I buried it. Busyness is a powerful anesthetic. Fill every gap with noise, and there's no room for reflection. No space for questions that don't have easy answers. I worked harder, stayed distracted longer, told myself productivity was progress, and from the outside, it looked convincing. But internally, the unease grew, a sense that I was reacting. Instead of choosing, that life was happening to me, instead of through me. Still, I said nothing, because admitting the crack would mean acknowledging what it threatened to become. That's how early warnings fail. Not because they set are invisible, but because they ask us to act before we feel ready, and most people wait. I waited until the cracks stopped being theoretical and started demanding attention. Cracks don't stay small forever. They widen quietly, fed by time, by pressure, by the belief that tomorrow will offer a better moment to respond. At some point, the discomfort stopped being subtle. It became visible, not dramatic, but undeniable. Relationships felt strained in ways I couldn't name. Decisions carried a heaviness they never used to. The future, once expansive, began to feel still. I told myself this was temporary. This is where denial evolves. It stops being passive and becomes strategic. You start justifying instead of questioning, defending instead of examining, explaining away what your instincts are screaming. This is not that bad. Everyone feels this way eventually. This is the price of stability. I said these things out loud, and people around me nodded, because they were saying the same things to themselves. That's how entire societies drift. When enough people normalize the wrong feeling, it stops sounding like a warning and starts sounding like wisdom. History repeats this pattern relentlessly. Leaders delay action to avoid panic. Institutions protect appearances over foundations. Families preserve routines while intimacy erodes behind closed doors. No one wants to be the one who says, "Something is wrong," because that sentence demands responsibility. I could feel it then, a growing distance between who I was becoming and who I thought I was. But acknowledging that gap would have meant changing course, and change threatens everything. Denial is built to protect comfort, identity, the illusion of control. So I doubled down. I committed harder to paths that no longer felt right. I stayed silent when honesty would have disrupted the peace. I convinced myself endurance was the same thing as strength. There is a moment, right before things truly unravel, when clarity briefly appears, a heavy realization that something essential has already been compromised. I felt it. A quiet thought I didn't want to finish forming. If this continues, something one day survive. And still, I did nothing. Because by then denial wasn't just a habit. It was a refuge, and leaving it would mean facing the cost of all the time already spent, ignoring the truth. That's when I finally understood, not everything collapses from impact. Some things collapse from hesitation. And I was running out of time to hesitate. There is always a last moment when things can still be saved. It doesn't feel heroic. It doesn't feel cinematic. It feels inconvenient. I can see it now with painful clarity. The exact window where a different choice was still possible. Nothing was ruined yet. Nothing had fully broken. But the weight of neglect had reached a tipping point. All that was required, was honesty. An honest conversation. An honest admission. An honest willingness to disrupt the life I had carefully maintained. And I hesitated. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I knew what it would cost. Admitting the truth would mean dismantling narratives I'd relied on for years. It would mean disappointing people. It would mean risking stability for the unknown. So I waited. Waiting feels harmless. It disguises itself as patience, as wisdom, as restraint. But sometimes, waiting is just fear, in a more respectable outfit. That moment passed quietly. No dramatic failure. No clear signal. Just the subtle closing of a door I assumed would remain open. I didn't feel the loss immediately. That's what makes it so cruel. By the time consequences arrive, the choice that caused them is already inaccessible. This is what regret is made of. Not catastrophic mistakes, but missed courage. The things you almost said. The decisions you postponed one day too long. I remember realizing it was over. Not when everything collapsed, but when effort stopped making a difference. That's how you know the point has passed. Once systems lose flexibility, once trust erodes beyond repair, once time has moved forward without your consent, no amount of urgency can restore what delay destroyed. I had crossed it without noticing, and all that remained was to watch the consequences unfold. Because after that moment, there are no more warnings, only outcomes. Collapse doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in. At first, there was confusion, a strange disbelief that this was really happening. That effort, real effort, was no longer enough to hold things together. I tried to fix what was already failing, tried to speak with urgency, where I had once spoken with delay, tried to recover ground that time had quietly claimed. But the responses were different now, colder, shorter, heavier with finality. This is the phase no one prepares you for, when consequences replace choices, when the future is no longer something you shape, but something you brace for. Conversations lose warmth, silences stretch longer than words, familiar places begin to feel foreign, and the most unsettling part, life keeps going. The world does not stop to acknowledge your loss. Mornings still arrive, people still laugh elsewhere. The sun rises with no regard for what has ended. That indifference is devastating. because it forces you to confront the truth. Whatever collapsed mattered far more to you than it ever did to time. I remember the quiet moments most, not the arguments, not the explanations, the absence, the sudden lack of effort on both sides, the realization that what once required maintenance had slipped beyond reach. This is where people look for villains, someone to blame, something dramatic to point at. But collapse like this has no single cause. It's just the accumulated weight of ignored moments, unspoken truths, deferred courage. Fear settles in differently now, not sharp, not frantic, but hollow, a numb understanding that something irreplaceable has finished becoming past. And once you see it clearly, once you understand that this is not a phase, not a setback, not a lesson you can immediately apply, you stop fighting, not out of weakness, but out of recognition. Because some things don't break loudly. They fade until resistance no longer makes sense. What follows isn't set chaos. It's just emptiness, and in that emptiness, you finally hear the truth you avoided for decades. But by then, there's just nothing left to save. After the collapse, there is no explosion, no dramatic ending, no clear line between before and after. There is just what remains. A life that still functions, but feels lighter in the wrong way. Rooms sound different when something important is gone. Time stretches, silence grows teeth. You replay moments you once rushed through, now slowed down by regret. This is where realization finally settles in. Not as panic, not as anger, but as weight. A heavy understanding that what you lost was never taken from you. You handed it away, slowly, politely, one delay at a time. I began to see my past clearly then, not as a series of failures, but as a long conversation I kept avoiding. Every ignored feeling, every postponed truth, every time I chose comfort over clarity. They weren't isolated, they were connected. This is the aftermath no one talks about. The way memory becomes sharper, when there's nothing left and nothing left to distract you. The way you start measuring time, not by years ahead, but by years already spent. I understood then that life doesn't punish you for mistakes. It simply honors the patterns you repeat. And the most painful realization of all, nothing that happened was inevitable. There was no single villain, no cruel twist of fate, just a series of moments where courage was required and delayed. That perhaps when grief changes shape, it's no longer about what ended, but about what was possible. The life that could have existed if I had listened sooner, if I had spoken earlier, if I had chosen discomfort when it mattered. Regret is quiet, but it sits relentless. It doesn't shout, it waits, and it visits you in ordinary moments, while making coffee, while walking alone, while realizing no one is left to explain things to. This is where most people stop looking back, because looking forward feels safer. But I stayed with it, because buried beneath the regret was something else, something unfinished, a truth I hadn't fully faced yet. And once I saw it clearly, I knew it couldn't stay with me alone. If you're still listening to this, then you are standing exactly where I once stood, in the space before things are obviously broken, before collapse has a name, before regret has weight. This is the part I wish someone had forced me to hear, not gently, not kindly, but honestly. Nothing you care about is on autopilot. Not love, not meaning, not time. They all require attention before they demand repair. You don't lose your life all at once. You lose it in the gaps between intention and action. In the pauses where fear talks you into waiting. In the moments you convince yourself that tomorrow is guaranteed. It isn't stat. Pay attention to the quiet warnings. The unease you keep dismissing. The conversations you keep postponing. The parts of yourself you keep telling to be patient. They are not asking for patience. They are asking for courage. If something feels fragile, it's just because it is. If something feels distant, it's already moving. And if something feels too important to risk disrupting, that's the very thing that ones that survive neglect. Don't wait for clarity to arrive with force. It won't stay. It arrives softly, once, and leaves if you ignore it. I learned this too late. But you haven't started. Not yet. And one day, whether you act or not, this moment will become a memory. The only question is, what kind of memory it will be.